Are you still there? Are you still there? If you want, we can chat. Since this is a new video, in a way it's actually more practical. That way I don't have to. That way I don't have to like ensure that I'm being more concise. So I'm just gonna stop that video there. Twitch. Okay, nobody here. Mental states is gone. Oh, you're back. Yeah, I'm back. Yeah, so I'm gonna just export that video now. Well, I'm gonna wait till I've maybe done this one as well. I don't know. So it's actually good because now it makes a new video, and so now I've got a concise first video where oh, you got an ad. Oh really? Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's giving you ads. Yeah. Of course that gives me money, I think. Although I think Twitch is taking most of it. But yeah. Um yeah, it's good because now I've got a concise video that lasts just like half an hour that explains where I'm at. And now if you want, we can just chat about other stuff if you want. Or otherwise not. I don't know if you've got anything to say. I don't really necessarily have all that much to to say. I mean, I said what I felt I needed to say. Of course I could have gone into more detail, but then that would have been maybe a bit long. Um, so I mean the main news is I'm back in New Zealand. I've been back for 2 months. Oh, you've been diving into politics lately? Okay, anything in particular you want to share that you've discovered? Any opinions that you've formed? You know, anything like that? Um, I haven't really changed much in my politics opinions. Um, I mean that's not surprising, but yeah. I mean, I like I said, I've finished my Constitution of the Universal States. So obviously, that required a bit of refinement of my ideas, but nothing, no major overhaul. Not really any. Yeah, obviously, I still have the same. Hello, Doctor Metaverse 2. Wait, is it? Are you Boston or something? Um, or are you somebody else? Are you just Doctor Metaverse, or do I know you like under another name? Um. Anyway, um. So yeah, I don't know. Anybody want to share or something at this point? Now I changed the title. This is just chatting because I don't really know what to chat. We can like do games or something. Nathan has resurfaced slow. You're Boston, right, Doctor Metaverse? I think, right? Because Boston came under a new name, but I don't remember that. I think it sort of seems to me that was that. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Why did you change? Why did you change names? Europe is on the verge of economic collapse. Germany, the engine of the EU, is reliant on cheap energy to be competitive. That's gone now. They'll have to industrialize. Well, I mean, Germany is an industrialized country. I mean, it's like the number one industrialized country of Europe, along with like the UK. It's a more interesting name. I mean, Boston Strong's kind of interesting too, I guess. Um, oh, deindustrialized. Um, why deindustrialize? Um, I mean, in any case, Germany has a bunch of, you know, native power energy sources, right? I mean, it's got its coal and now it's built a fair bit of like wind and solar, although of course that's very unreliable. But I guess the point is that I mean, they would have to basically use a lot more coal now. And they'd have to start mining a lot more coal if they want to stop being dependent on Russia. Um, uh, so that sort of Yeah, it's not so much that they have to deindustrialize. It's just, I mean, yeah, it's just that they will de facto end up making less stuff because they don't have the energy to make stuff. Um, yeah, they have what called no nuclear reactors. Yeah, well, nah, because they wanted to stop doing nuclear reactors, which was actually a dumb idea. But because there was this whole sort of anti-nuclear sentiment, which probably wasn't all that rational because nuclear power plants, actually overall are plenty safe. Um, so really, that was a pretty poor decision. On the other hand, I've now become even. I mean, I never thought global warming was that bad, and in some ways, I was looking forward to it. And now, over the past year or two, kind of since I've started, over the time since I started, streaming and stuff, this and I've basically um, come to realize that the benefits of global warming, I mean, not only are there benefits, not just drawbacks, but literally the benefits clearly outweigh the drawbacks. Um, Mostly because it's going to vastly expand agricultural territory, especially in Russia and Canada, which mostly is currently not suitable for agriculture, but with global warming should be. And likewise for the Sahara, which soon should become, turn into savanna because of extra precipitation. And so that's just it vastly increases, the usable land. So that's I think it's going to outweigh like even like I said, the main economic loss I think is going to be cities being drowned. But sea level rise is very slow, so I mean, by the time that kind of stuff happens, the economy should be much greater. I mean, again, barring uh catastrophes that prevent the global economy from growing, the economy would be a lot bigger by the time it really becomes a problem that cities get flooded, like majorly so. And so, at that point, we'll have plenty of money to solve that. And meanwhile, well, we will have all this new cultivable surface. And of course, that the temperature rise should go a lot faster, right? Because the sea level rise comes from the ice melting, and that the ice takes a while to melt. Um, so um, I think it's clearly a good thing. We should be looking forward to global warming, and yeah, Germany should just import more coal and oil and whatever it needs, and just use that. Um, so. Anyway, you said, I'm sorry, I haven't really been keeping up, though I saw that you'd written stuff. Yes, and well, it's more that I just wanted to finish my thought. Yes, and the stuff they make will be much more expensive and won't be bought. Um, I don't know about the economics of that. That seems likely. I'll take your word for it for now. I haven't really, again, I just kind of like to focus on the big issues and like the specifics of policy. I'll just figure I'll leave it to other people. But yes, that seems very plausible. And obviously, yeah, I mean, Europe is going to suffer from it, from this Russian blockage, undoubtedly. So, yeah. But the point is that it's not really a problem because there's plenty of other energy sources, and ultimately, I don't really think that any energy source is that much of a problem. So yeah, if you want to go for coal, go for coal. So then your next comment, for decades, climate activists have been pushing to scale down investments in fossil fuels to the point there is underinvestment. Because of this, Germany, the EU can't scale up, drill new wells, etc. fast. Yeah, of course. Of course they can't that and that's kind of a problem. Obviously they can't just do it right away. Um, yeah. So obviously for like, in the short term, there's going to be an economic downturn from loss of energy. That I think is to be expected. Um, and you could say that that was kind of, it seemed like a somewhat likely scenario, though of course it was hard to know for sure because, I mean, in any case, like when you think of oil, like pretty much all oil like comes from like dubious sources, and like you think of Venezuela, you think of these Arabian countries. Um, so I mean, I guess people just kind of were used to having, you know, basically their main, very important sources of energy being fundamentally dependent on risky, risky countries. Um, and maybe that, they kind of became a bit resigned to that fact and maybe didn't, um, try to ensure that that wouldn't happen for like other sources than oil, than petroleum. So, um, I don't know. I'm just trying to think maybe why they didn't plan ahead like that. But of course, then there's, of course, like you say, the climate activism itself. So he says there are other energy sources, but 5 times as expensive. Germany doesn't have any liquid gas installations, for example. Um, I mean, I don't know the economics. I mean, what energy sources are you referring to? I mean, we know that there are these like sources of coal in Germany, right? There are these big like coal mines. So I don't know, is it that you're referring to? There is also some petroleum in Germany. I know that, but I think it is kind of hard to extract compared to like in the Arabian countries. Um, so again, I don't know like the figures regarding that. I don't know about the natural gas reserves. I think there's some too, but I'm not really sure. So yeah, I mean, they haven't really done a great job. Um, in fact, nuclear probably would have been the best bet. Um, and they had nuclear, but then all this activism, anti-nuclear activism led them to shutting down nuclear, and they didn't properly develop coal. And of course, coal is very polluting. I mean, not so much, I'm not talking about CO2, but the other stuff. Um, Coal is very polluting, and that is bad for people's health, right? I mean, that causes all sorts of diseases and stuff. So that is a problem, but now we've got like technology to make it a lot less polluting, so that's not really a problem anymore, right? You can have like, like filtration and stuff. So like in practice, the coal can be really pretty clean. Um, so I think that, yeah, I think we should be okay with coal but we shouldn't actively be favoring coal with respect to other sources. You say there are some, but again, 5 times more expensive is disastrous for consumers and energy bill that's 5 times higher. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, basically, they shouldn't have shut down the nuclear plants. Um, and yeah, basically that. Um, and it's the death blow for the German industry. Well, it'll certainly harm German industry. Uh, I'm not, again, I don't know enough to be able to like even speculate about whether or not it would be so harmful that it could be considered a death blow. Um, I can't really say. Is Germany going to become like a sort of a new Rust Belt kind of thing? Maybe. I don't know. I wouldn't have thought so, but yeah, I mean, again, I don't really know enough to really be able to say. I think Germany can rebound because it's not, obviously the prices are going up, but the prices can go back down either if obviously if the situation with Russia gets resolved, but also once they, get these other energy sources going, it'll be able to be cheaper. So you say there's alternatives which are 5 times expensive, but maybe now, we've got 5 times as expensive alternatives. But, once they've adapted to not being able to get Russian stuff, I imagine that that's no longer going to be the case. So my guess would be that German, it's would be a kind of like a recession, but it's not. I would guess it wouldn't be an actual like death blow, for the German industry. But of course, like I said, I don't really know for sure. Um, so yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I don't really. You say the reason is that economists the last decade valued the financial economy more than the real economy. No effort was made to secure strategic resources because they could always be bought. Well, I guess I don't think economists. I mean, obviously, like bankers, like would prefer, care about the financial economy mostly. I don't think economists only care about that. What I would say rather is that what you're saying is that they weren't sort of, um, kind of planning for, uh, not being able to have access to foreign sources of material products, right? So basically, they were planning on continuing to have a a pretty well globalized economy and where you've got access to products from pretty much everywhere. And I think so they didn't plan that they might have to be a bit more self-reliant, I guess. Yes, that I would agree. Um, but of course the thing is that would have probably been more expensive to be more self-reliant. I mean, it's more economical, it's cheaper, it's more efficient to be globalized and have, different places specialize in different things. So, I mean, if we had known that it was going to remain stable, then it was probably the right thing to do, I would say. You're saying the current academics and leaders of Europe are killing Europe. Um, I don't think again, I think that's kind of overblown. I mean, obviously there's stuff, there's criticism to be made. Um, on the other hand, I would say that I'm probably more critical of most people who say that kind of thing than these actual sort of academics and leaders themselves. Um, because I feel that usually the alternatives that the people who say that the academics and leaders are doing bad, well, I feel like the alternatives that they're suggesting are typically even worse. Um, not in all respects necessarily, but overall, I feel that that's typically the case. I mean, overall, the economy benefits from globalization, and I'm absolutely in favor of that. And typically, the people who say that are very much anti-globalization. Um, so yeah, of course, it can be good to try to foresee the kind of these kind of events, but of course, if Russia itself had adopted the kind of mentality that they have in Europe, well, it wouldn't be trying to attack Europe and we wouldn't have this problem in the first place, right? So you can't really blame the academics. I mean, it's not their or the current European leaders. I mean, this is not really their fault. It's the fault of Putin for getting people into this mess. Of course, you could say that it's their fault for then having orchestrated a coup in Ukraine in 2014. So obviously there's blame also on that side. Um, so again, it's not like one side's totally right and another side is totally wrong. But I mean, you say culmination of extremely bad decisions from underinvestment, lockdowns, stirring up a war between Ukraine and Russia while Russia was Europe's vital, reliable supplier of cheap energy. Again, Putin himself has been largely stirring the war himself. Like I think fundamentally he wants a war. He wants to be belligerent. He wants to create an empire just to because he feels that that's what a sort of a strong leader should do. Um, Largely he just himself has gotten himself into this. That being said, of course, there have been provocations very much on behalf of the West, on behalf of NATO and all that. Russia asked to join NATO back in like in 1990, around 2000. Like I can't remember what year exactly, but and he was refused, right? So and then, of course, in 2014, there's the whole this whole supposed revolution that really seems to have been a CIA-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014. Um, so obviously they've done that. So um, that obviously was silly. I mean, but you could potentially also understand from a strategic viewpoint, but then it makes it very hypocritical, right? Because they claim that it's all democracy and that was a spontaneous pro-democracy revolution when actually it was just a CIA-backed coup that was meant to benefit mostly the United States and also Western Europe. Um, so you say the breakup of the Soviet Union left a lot of ethnic Russians outside of the border of Russia. Yeah, that is true. You've got a lot of ethnic Russians in Ukraine in particular, um, and in other countries, ex-USSR countries. Um, that's true. That's true. I mean, you can understand from that perspective why Putin is doing that, but the things that in those places, well, there's lots of other ethnicities as well. I mean, I'm in any case opposed to the whole concept of ethnostates. I think, it's a silly notion. I'm from Switzerland. You've got three main ethnicities. It works fine to have three main ethnicities in the same country. You don't need to have separate countries for separate ethnicities. I see that as a manifestation of racism. I mean, the whole concept of it's an ethno-state. For me, an ethno-state is a racist concept. So I don't support that. Um, like I said, I'm a supporter of the universal state, right? I want a single state that encompasses everyone. it'll make things so much easier. I mean, I've really been seeing that traveling, it's such a hassle. Every time you change country, you've got to do all this stuff, you've got to change your phone number, and if you like, you've got to change, if you like, obviously if you're working, you got to change your whole like tax registration and whatnot. Of course you've got to show your passport when you're changing, countries. Now I've got all these COVID tests and stuff, and I mean, it's it's really a hassle. It's really a hassle, and often you can't buy stuff. You've got like separate websites for each country, and often in one country you just don't have access to stuff, and often between countries there's like different prices, and it's just a hassle. It would be much more economically efficient. And there's all these tariffs and stuff from for importations, and um, we're losing out a lot. There's just a lot of economic waste from having separate countries. So I mean, it really would be much, much better to just have a single entity, a single state. Um, so that is what I am definitely pushing for. Um, so I guess my point is that I sort of mostly agree with the sort of, Western quote position, EU-ish position against Russia on most things, but I think they're kind of hypocritical in the sense that, they claim that they're like pro democracy and liberalism and all that, but they actually aren't all that much, since they're still in favor of ethno-states, and they're still basically, I mean, the EU is not really democratic, right? You can elect people who will then elect people to be part of the EU Parliament. An actual democracy, you'd have direct democracy with, people directly voting on issues. You'd have a popular votation, again, like in Switzerland, on actual issues for, you're not just voting for people, you're voting on an issue, like the propositions in some states of the United States. That would be actual democracy, and they would be also advocating to get rid of separate nation states, and they're not really doing that. And they're pretending that like the coup that they did in Ukraine is just a spontaneous revolution. So there's tons of hypocrisy, and that obviously means that I don't actually support them. I will support them if I have to choose sides. I will support the EU against Russia, but obviously I do not actually particularly like them. Um, anyway, so going to your comments, and then Ukraine started sending out extremist right-wing militias to Donbass, outlaw Russian language and culture, and the torture and killing started, idolize off right sector. Yeah, and exactly, and that, right, which is absolutely, and that was disgusting, right? It was a coup, and they knew at the time when they did the coup, and then later on, in all the years that followed, that it was very much associated with all these sort of Nazi groups and extreme militias and stuff, and that was actually supported by the CIA and by MI6 and all that. Um, so I mean, like, that is obviously a bad sort of thing, and they're denying that, they pretend that it's just democracy and it's all nice and and all fairyland and stuff, and in fact there's lots of nastiness. But again, what Russia accuses, the the main things that Russia says that is bad about Europe is not actually bad at all. Like economic liberalism and social liberalism, like sort of being okay with people being gay and stuff like that. Like he's just, stirring up these weird sort of paranoias that are just completely ridiculous, actually. Um, so that kind of idea of the West being bad for those reasons is nonsense. The reason the West is bad is because it's actually, in many ways, it is a lot like Russia without admitting it. That's the thing. It's also, to some extent, still ethno-nationalistic. It's still actually, rather authoritarian, undemocratic, and and violent. And so that's what makes the West bad. It's not what distinguishes it from Russia, but rather what makes it similar to Putin's Russia. That makes this sort of Western coalition bad. Ukraine fight for democracy and transgender rights are European politicians literally saying. Well, I mean, some Ukrainians are, but definitely just presenting it like that and saying that the people in power since 2014 are just that is wrong. Yeah, absolutely. There's all sorts of extremist groups, exactly like you mentioned. Um, And yeah, there's been all sorts of nasty stuff going on, exactly like you're saying, and they've been supporting that, and so and that is disgusting, and that is again that is part of the hypocrisy. I hadn't really even really thought of that much until he mentioned it, and yeah, absolutely. I mean that is wrong and it's bad, and I mean if Putin again, I would even support Putin if Putin was better than the EU and whatnot. And but the thing is that he isn't. Putin himself is a major asshole himself, and he might be less of an asshole than those extreme militias in Ukraine, but he's more of an asshole than the average sort of EU position overall. At least ignoring the fact that the EU defended those extremist groups in Ukraine. So I mean, I certainly am not going to support Putin. Um, so again, it's just the silliness of people pretending to be the good guys. On all sides, they always pretend that they're the good guys when actually they aren't. Um, and this is again the problem with having these separate states is that there's these conflicts of interest, and then there's all these people that get in power, and or even just the population, and they want to fight each other, and it's just this ridiculous tribalism, and just so much evil and idiocy and dishonesty, and it's just appalling. It's just appalling. I mean, just so disgusting. So I mean, yeah, that's why you need the universal state. With the universal state, you get rid of all that crap. Okay, the universal state, the government is under control of everybody, of the people, except for like the criminal people, but everybody else, the mentally fit, non-criminal people of Earth, get to collectively vote on issues, and they don't vote for candidates. So it's not like you don't. It's not like you vote for a president and the president decides stuff. No, you actually vote on the stuff that otherwise, like you'd have like Congress or whatever voting on. Um, but obviously, you also have representatives because there's too much to vote on for everyone to vote on because it would take too much time for everyone. But the representatives would be chosen by sortition, by lottery, because that actually works better. Obviously, only in groups. You can't have one person selected by lottery. It has to be like a big group of people. So that's like when you do a scientific experiment, and you do you take a sample of the population. The sample is almost certainly going to be representative of the population if it's big enough. Um, so you say it's Western propaganda. Yeah, sure. Sure they do, but of course Russia has massive propaganda. Um, there's propaganda on both sides, and I would say Russian propaganda, I mean, is worse overall. Maybe not about Ukraine. Um, like Russian propaganda, I mean, Russia is actually more truthful about those extremist groups in Ukraine. Um, the, the Russia is actually more truthful about those bad groups in Ukraine, but overall, Russia is more misleading and wrong and paranoid, and wrong both factually and morally. Um, so again, I mean, Russia is really in a bad state right now. But sure, there's plenty of EU propaganda, definitely. Ukraine can trust nobody. Yeah, that's true. Ukraine is kind of being used by both sides, and it's victimized by both sides. And neither side really genuinely cares about doing what's best for Ukraine. Um, when you say Russia is very bad in propaganda, what do you mean by that? Are you agreeing with me that it is doing lots of propaganda, or do you mean that it's not doing propaganda? It's not managing to do propaganda. Um, but yeah, I mean, but yeah, Ukraine is basically being just yeah, it's being abused by both sides. Um, and that is quite it's unfortunate again, and it frustrates me. And so um, basically, we should again, the solution is universal state. I'm not gonna. Yeah, all other solutions are bad solutions. Again, all other solutions involve having ethno states or just separate states that will fundamentally always have their interest at odds, right? As long from the moment you have independent states, those states will vie against one another and they'll try to basically hurt each other. Um, and they'll create all this sort of anti-economic barriers, as well as I mentioned just before. But you say, but these are the talk shows. The Russian DoD and Foreign Affairs seem to be more honest than their Western counterparts. Um, Honestly, I actually haven't seen enough to be able to comment on that. Um, I actually don't know. It's possible. It's possible. Um, Maybe what do you think the Russian in that kind of sphere, in the actual sort of official political sphere, Russia isn't actually doing much propaganda, and they're just sort of stating stuff more factually. Um, I'd have to look that up more. Um, Again, I'm not following that much again because, like I say, because I don't support nation states. I just want to get rid of them. So I'm not really interested in a way, like I don't need to know the details of how these things work to know that they should be eliminated. Like religion, I'm against religion. I don't need to study theology in detail to know that it's foolish, right? It's the same, or like any kind of pseudoscience, it's the same. I don't need to study some kind of like astrology. I don't need to be an expert in astrology to know that it's foolish, right? Um, you say still check everything twice, trust nothing on face value. Yeah, of course, of course. Um, yeah. So I don't know, but I think basically people are getting really pissed off very globally at Putin. I think that is probably quite good because that means that it basically kind of potentially will weaken. It creates an opportunity. It weakens the current regime in Russia probably, and it creates an opportunity for regime change. Um, Hopefully for the better. Of course, it could become worse, but um, yeah, hopefully it will spur a regime change in Russia for the better. Um, Obviously, it doesn't seem to be like it'll be right now the case, and when I say more likely, it doesn't mean that's actually all that likely necessarily. I mean, it doesn't look like Putin is about to be ousted right now or anytime soon, but it just makes it seem somewhat more likely. Um, it just, it kind of just destabilizes things overall. Um, so yeah, again, I'm of course hoping to make Russia be part of the universal state, as I've said, and of course, but for now, I am not known at all. I am almost, I mean, you know me, but almost nobody else does. So, obviously, currently, I'm not in any position to influence that, but hopefully, I'm just optimistically hoping that that is going to happen. Uh, Again, just statistically, you wouldn't expect that me to ever be able to reach that position. But as I've said, because of the Gorth thing, I think that the Gorth actually wants to make me become famous at some point. Which is why I'm saying this. I mean, otherwise, of course, I wouldn't have hopes. And of course, which is why I never started streaming before I knew about the Gorth, because I never thought I had a chance. And again, I still don't think I do without the Gorth's intervention. Um, to say it's my position that everybody should study the great world religions since they're a source for enormous amount of thought, art, philosophy, sociology, culture. I know you and I like you. Thank you. Oh, I'm not. Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I mean, you can certainly gain lots of knowledge and insights and stuff. Um, Absolutely. So in that sense, it can absolutely be interesting to study. I'm just saying that you don't have to study it. And you don't have to study it to criticize it. That's the other thing. You don't have to study it um, you don't have to study a particular religion in depth to perceive its flaws and to to know it well enough to know that it is fundamentally flawed and just fundamentally wrong, right? Um, so that is what I mean by that. I mean, sure, there's plenty of interesting stuff, and I mean, like my beliefs on the Gorth are actually largely derived from religion, in particular, Yahwehism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, um, in particular Christianity more than the others. but obviously I'm not taking at face value. Um, and then, of course, my view on psychology sort of largely aligns with Buddhism, in as much as I sort of support this sort of whole concept of, what they call enlightenment. Um, so, and that's good also for, if I actually wanted to, gain support from people, because, everybody can sort of feel like they're being somewhat valued, like, like their original beliefs are being valued by me. I am using these beliefs, but obviously in a different fashion. Um, so yeah, there's plenty of, and I could go more in depth, and I would discover other valuable stuff from studying these religions. Um, I guess my point is more, if you take my point is that, taken just literally, uh, in their entirety, these religions are, quite obviously wrong, and extremely wrong. Um, and I guess likewise, that's what I mean about like these ethno states, is that I could study them much more in detail. I could study about how they function, about why, whatever. Um, but I don't need to study them in depth to see the obvious flaws. I can see the big picture knowing very little, and that big picture is sufficient for me to be able to support a single, planetary or universal state, as opposed to having multiple ones. Um, you say, are you familiar with Meister Eckhart? You might find his work interesting. Yeah, I'm familiar with the name. I haven't actually. Yeah, I mean, he's like a medieval Christian mystic. Um, and yeah, so I've okay, YouTube. Let's have a look. Um, okay, it's coming up. It's just a bit slow. My strike heart. Yeah. Um, I haven't read anything. What I've read is there's this book that was pretty successful about a guy who took the name from him. Oh, hello, Ben Jerome. Um, sorry, I'm just a bit late at responding because I was getting the video up, and I just have to. Um, oops. Oh, crap. Oh, fuck. That was my bank account. Uh-oh. Why did it go onto my bank account instead of... I guess I'll have to... I don't know if that showed my um this is annoying. What have I got on Chrome? Now I'll have... Sorry, it's just taking a bit of time for me to show it. Oh yeah. Okay, there we go. Atheist. Okay, so hi. So hi, Ben Jerome. Have I seen you before under another name, or are you new here? Hello, General Pro, and same question. Um, I don't recall either of your names. So are you new here or not? Um, okay. So anyway, you've been here. Okay, but you haven't been here that much, I guess. Okay, I'm sorry if I forgot. Okay, so you're from California, so you must have seen that video I made when I was leaving California. Um, okay, so anyway, sorry. If you want, we can watch the Meister Eckhart video. Like I was just saying, I saw that book of that guru called Eckhart Tolle, who took the name from Meister Eckhart. So that's the only sort of Eckhart thing I've actually read. I'd imagine that reading some sort of medieval text would probably be a lot harder. Um, but yeah, I just, like, my parents had it, like, received it from someone, and so I just read that Eckhart Tolle book. And I quite liked it. That actually sort of what mm, probably the main thing that actually got me sort of aware of this sort of whole concept of enlightenment. And I think that, yeah, it seems, it strikes me as quite plausible, as a sort of a thing. I just see it as a form of genuine mental health. I see it just as, yeah, the kind of way that you should be perceiving things, as sort of genuine mental maturity and mental health, and just sort of a way to sort of live in a more enjoyable fashion. Um, so yeah. You say play a bit, stop and comment. It's 44 minutes, so fairly long. Yeah. So you say, um, so you say mental states. You said you've been raised as an humanist and atheist. You've been raised as that? Are you still humanist and atheist, or not? Mm. And Ben Jerome, are you still here? Okay, we can have a look now. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Right. I'll put on my headphones, that way it won't be recorded. I mean, otherwise it would interfere with the sound. Okay, sorry, I'm just being a bit slow. Apologies. Um, not connected.
A curious situation in the current world. In some parts of the world, especially in secularized Europe, being religious is sometimes seen as something rather embarrassing, as something irrational.
You're still
Religion
non-dogmatic, but
generally is
have a
seen
decent
as
interest in
often
mystic
being
thought.
dangerous or opposed to
Okay.
modern ideas.
Yeah, and it's true. He's saying that religion is sort of viewed as dangerous now, and it, in much of Europe. On the other hand, I mean, I feel that there still isn't enough opposition to religion. But at the same time, it's true that there is. Like, I am glad that there isn't more opposition to religion from a purely sort of materialistic perspective. Like, the sort of people, the sort of scientist establishment crowd that will deny that there are any of these sort of other sort of, like, what you'd call supernatural or whatever phenomena. They are obviously actually irrational, and they are very much harming and hampering the discoveries of that kind of those things. Um, and that is, it's almost a religion in itself, really. It's sort of, um, you could call it like materialism, if you will. And that is actually a kind of religion, and that is also harmful. So I'm glad that isn't stronger. But I do think there should be opposition to that, but I do also very much think that there should be more opposition to religion. I think, religions, when you taken really literally and seriously, and they're very, very harmful. I mean, they're full of horrific things. And so, I mean, as he says, when he says that, people, now see it as sometimes as something to be slightly ashamed of, um, I think that's good. I think people should be even more ashamed of it because, um, I mean, there's really lots and lots of nasty stuff. If you really take the religion literally, and as religious people typically do, um, irreligious people often, on the other hand, will just take a sort of a healthy interest in religion and will just see that as a source of knowledge, right? Um, but the problem is that religions are very, yeah, as you said, they're dogmatic and I mean, I must have explained sort of in greater detail elsewhere why I think that these religions are harmful. Humans can be harmful, even atheists. Well, the thing is that it's. Oh wait, and you said in the truest form, religion is a secular organized spirituality. Yeah, but then it's not really a religion at that point. See, that's the thing, is that in its truest form, religion is then not a religion. I mean, it's something else. Then it's just a healthy practice, you could say, right? A religion, to me, fundamentally, is an irrational, dogmatic, widely shared, belief, right? That to me is a religion, and so that should be fought. An actual interest in, spirituality or whatever. Um, Even if organized, then it's not necessarily a religion. Um, to me, to me, what defines religion is the fact that the belief is irrational, I guess. You could define it differently. If you define it that it's just some sort of organized spirituality, but then you could even say that all sorts of psychological techniques, are like just doing like meditation or something is religion, but it isn't really religion, right? To me, religion is really more like a belief system. But if you make it a belief system, if you say any belief system is religion, then you can also say that belief systems based on science are religion. And I don't really think that's right either. So I feel that what all extant religions have in common is that they're irrational. So to me, it does make sense to have that element of irrationality um, to religion, and instead, rational scientific practices, we should just say that they're sort of scientific or like meta scientific practices. Um, so you say, is my opinion, I have a dislike to worldly hierarchies. Okay, so I mean, I have a dislike to hierarchies as well. Um, so yeah, yeah. Humans can be hard to believe in atheists, as you said. Yes, absolutely. Um, absolutely. I mean, atheists have done a lot of harm. I mean, we've seen with all these, all these communist governments, there has been a huge amount of harm, by, in particular, like communists, like Marxist, Leninists, or whatnot, um, who were mostly atheists. So, yeah, sure. But of course, then I mean, then it's a doctrine itself that is a quasi. I mean, Marxist-Leninism, Marxism is a quasi-religion. Uh, you could also say. Um, you say religion is, of course, more than baseless belief, and yes, there's a lot of psychology in religion. Remember, before the 20th century, when people had mental health problems, they could turn to literature, music, and religion. Um, yeah, well, yeah. I mean, there is more to religion than base. I mean, there's some stuff that religion is true, if that's what you mean. But the problem is that at its core, it's still a baseless belief. See, at its core, it's still, I mean, not necessarily totally baseless in the sense that they have some very limited evidence, but it's not good evidence, and it's pretty clearly, almost certainly wrong. Um, and so in that sense, like, and really at the fundamental level, at the most important level, if you just had to really just give a very concise description of any particular religion, that description would include would be just something that is quite clearly wrong, right? And so that's what I mean. You can have valid things in a religion, but you can have valid things just like you've got valid things in communism, you've got valid things in Nazism, but like as a whole, they're just still fundamentally wrong. You see, um, like you've got valid stuff in any belief system, um, but I don't think it's enough. It's not enough to have some valid elements for one to value that belief system. It has to, as a whole, the kind of the summary, the main elements have to be correct, right? And unfortunately, there's no religion that has, fundamentally correct, all correct main elements. Um, and that is why I say we have to oppose religion as we know it, because all people who are religious will believe in these main elements. I mean, yeah, there are a few people who might call themselves religious, but like to me, they're not even religious. The people who don't believe in the main elements of religion, I wouldn't call them as adherents of that religion, and nor would most adherents of that religion call them adherents of that religion. Um, so yeah, I that's why I think that it's obviously, it's a question of definition. Let's more of this. Oh no, we're not hearing it. Uh, this is a hassle. Now I've got these wireless headphones, but then it's nice because you don't have the wire, and the wire was sort of messing up. But
We find ourselves in a curious
sorry, I'm starting
situation in
over
the
again.
current world. In some parts of the world, especially in secularized Europe, being religious is sometimes seen as something rather embarrassing, as something irrational. Religion generally is seen as often being dangerous or opposed to modern ideals. But at the same time, people also love to call themselves spiritual. The term "I am spiritual but not religious" is a very common term in many of these contexts. The bulk of our
Yeah,
skepticism towards
yeah. but that's kind of more I mean, that's going to be the case more like nowadays in certain sort of quote progressive countries in Europe, or Europeanized countries. That's very much not going to be the case elsewhere in the world, where everyone is pretty much religious elsewhere, except for like China. But then like that's sort of separate. East Asia, that's a sort of separate context. Um, just because they weren't very religious originally, but everywhere else, people just are by and large going to be religious, and if they aren't religious, they're not so much going to say that they're spiritual but not religious. This is more really a quote Western phenomenon.
Religion
Yeah.
is usually aimed at or towards Christianity. To the majority of people in Europe, for example, Christianity is the religion by which other religions are measured. Christianity is even the religion by which the very word religion and what it means is kind of based. It is the framework upon which we understand what religion is supposed to be. In that
Mhm.
sense, Christianity often comes to represent something old and outdated, something irrational, silly beliefs in some man in the sky who watches over us. And by contrast, and by comparison, many of the religions from the East, so we say Hinduism or Buddhism and these kinds of religions, are viewed in a very different light in the Western world in Europe. This is partly the result of a very shallow understanding of the Christian tradition and a romanticizing of the more exotic religions like the Eastern traditions. Many of the theological critiques aimed at Christianity, like for example the idea that they believe in some man in the sky, is often more based on popular culture than it is on actual Christian theology. The intellectual tradition of Christian theology and mysticism is a broad, deep, and complex one, and a lot of it would probably be very intellectually stimulating to those who were willing to actually look a bit deeper rather than through very shallow pop culture infused misrepresentations. In fact, many of those ideas and philosophies that are so appealing to many people in the Eastern religions are usually very much present in the Abrahamic religions, including Christianity. In Christian mysticism,
Yeah, but the thing is that Christian mysticism is sort of a side thing, like in Buddhism and even like in the various sort of Hinduist stuff, like there is this concept of like enlightenment as being like the core, super important thing. Um, Whereas Christianity, the religion by and large does not actually recognize that as an essential tenet. So then there's some people that will get into mysticism through Christianity, and there will be a Christian mysticism that's developed. And so I actually will disagree. He says his sort of shallow vision that he talks about of people sort of romanticizing Eastern religions and sort of unfairly, criticizing the Abrahamic Yahwehist religion. I don't actually agree. I think that the popular conception is actually correct about that. I think the popular conception might be too quick to ignore the bad aspects of the Eastern religions. Yeah, that yes, there's laws. I mean, the cosmology is still going to be clearly wrong, but it's it does nonetheless have. I don't know even what mysticism really means, but like if you're sort of like developing your sort of your psychology and stuff, then developing your mind or whatnot, and sort of, and particularly this concept of enlightenment, then it really is at the core of these Indian-based religions, and it clearly is not at the core of these Christian ones. And the fact that there are some Christian mystics who talk about the same thing doesn't invalidate that sort of basic concept that fundamentally Yahwehism is not about that. It's not about sort of doing anything sort of special with your own mind. Um, like, yeah. So I think he's actually, I think he's wrong. I think the popular, what he calls the sort of popular, standard conception in the sort of liberal West is closer to being actually correct. Oh, Chad, hello. My best friend. I'm your best friend. Oh, hello, Chad. Hello, my best friend too. Um, how are you? Um, um, I'm just looking at this video that Mental States has sent me, and I've been sort of slightly discussing, my thoughts based on what he said. I've been saying some other stuff before. I'm not gonna repeat what I said. You say, great man, you're in Thailand now, just waiting for. Oh, you're just waiting for me. Really? Like a bride I just bought. Um. Anyway, yeah, I would love to come in and see you. But it's kind of far and expensive. But who knows? Maybe I might do it. I'm in New Zealand, so uh, it's only halfway to the exact opposite side of the world. So only about 12 hours total flying time, not counting the time that you wait in the airport. And I'd like to go to Thailand. Probably by now there's less COVID restrictions and stuff. So you say, well, the beginning of his explanations, he tries to make an opening and trench popular conceptions on Christian mysticism, just the beginning. Yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, I imagine he'll go on to other stuff. I think it's also just to make the audience maybe more receptive to what he's going to say, because presumably, like lots of people who are like into mysticism, they're just going to maybe reject anything that sort of sounds Christian. So from that perspective, it kind of makes sense to say what he's saying. Again, it's. Where are you?
Striking
Where are
similarities
you in
with
Thailand,
teachings from
chat?
Buddhism, Advaita
Are
Vedanta,
you in Bangkok?
Sufism, and some forms of Taoism. And this is why I want to dedicate this video to.
Yeah, but see again, Sufism, like Muslims by and large will say that Sufis aren't real Muslims, So.
To one of the most fascinating thinkers,
So
mystics, and philosophers in European and Christian history, the Dominican friar from Germany, the man from whom God hid nothing, Meister Eckhart. This video is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon community, and as always, I'm going to be mentioning some of the new arrivals to our Patreon team. So much, I will leave a link to my Patreon community. Eckhart von Hochheim is one of the most influential figures in Christian mysticism, one whose radical expressions of oneness with God and the ground of the soul garnered accusations of heresy, but also a list of devoted admirers and followers. Eckhart was born in Germany, near the city of Gotha, in around the year 1260. His earliest years are quite obscure, but we know that he probably entered the Dominican order in early adulthood and became a friar. In these monastic orders of Christianity, the difference between a friar.
Is this too fast at 1.5 speed, or?
And a monk is that a monk lives in a cloistered community that is isolated from the world, whereas a friar will take all the vows of celibacy and poverty while still living within society and doing things like
teaching and preaching
to the masses. And indeed, the
that's
first time Meister Eckhart appears in the historical record is in 1294, when he holds an Easter sermon in Paris as a junior professor. Only one instance that shows Meister Eckhart's very active and distinguished career as a teacher and preacher in different convents and in different universities. As a young Dominican, he would study theology and philosophy, perhaps under Albert the Great in Cologne. He seems to have been strongly influenced by Albert as well as Thomas Aquinas.
Okay, let's go back to one time.
Both of whom were his older contemporaries. The Dominican order at this time was characterized by a strong scholasticism and thereby a big emphasis on philosophy as an important complement to revelation and theology more broadly. They were especially influenced by the Greek philosopher Aristotle and studied many of his works along with his Muslim and Arabic commentators like Ibn Rushd or Averroes. To the Dominicans, rational philosophy was an important part in understanding the Bible and its message properly, something that distinguished them from the other major order at the time, the Franciscans, who were often highly critical of using Aristotelian philosophy. At this time, this was in fact a huge debate in the larger Christian world. These two opposing sides, which are often represented by the Dominican order on the one hand and the Franciscan order on the other, often argued about the compatibility of philosophy and theology or revelation. Meister Eckhart, naturally, since he was a Dominican, argued very much in favor of the use of philosophy and Aristotelianism. When we read his works and his sermons, we can clearly see very strong use and influence from the Aristotelian tradition. This is at the core of Meister Eckhart's ideas. As a teacher of theology and philosophy, we know that Eckhart worked as a lecturer on the works of Peter Lombard in Paris in the.
But see, that point, is it really in Christianity, or is it just, philosophizing in a sort of Christian environment, right? Is Eckhart's mysticism Christian at all? just, I mean, okay, he was Christian, but maybe that, you can be Christian, but you can also be other stuff. Like you can be a Christian and you can also be, a physicist or something, and like Newton was, and Newton's physics are not considered to be an aspect of Christianity. It's something independent, right? So in the same vein, I almost feel like presumably Eckhart would have kind of made links with Christianity, of course, but um, just because you sort of make links with it doesn't really mean that it actually is Christianity. I mean, you can sort of say that like science also, people were saying that I see, the work of God in this, this natural object or whatever. Um, but and then you could sort of say that that person was sort of a scientist at the same time. But like I don't know, to me it almost feels like that's not really Christianity. So it's something else. It's something that's sort of influenced by Christianity, but isn't actually Christianity. Um,
1290s. And after this, he would spend his time moving around a lot between different cities in the region for basically the rest of his life, being appointed to different positions of authority. A large portion of his life was spent in a convent in the city Erfurt, which is often considered his home convent. This is where he spent most of his time. He would preach here to other monks and members of the Dominican order. He would write many of his commentaries on the Bible and so on. In the year 1302, Eckhart returned to Paris, being appointed the Regent Master, which is the highest teaching position in the entire order, which is a kind of professorship with a teaching commitment. Only a year later,
Well, yes, but
between the
being
years
Christian and
13
what it
right.
means, like using Aristotle's rational thought to understand the writing, this was a nice surprise since the Christian I know are way more closed and dogmatic.
Yeah, yeah. But you could say that it's a particular person's sort of interpretation and mixing of Christianity and Greek and other philosophy, right? I wouldn't say it really is necessarily
to
Christian
1311,
itself.
he served as provincial, that is, the Dominican authority over the entire.
But yeah, I mean, I'd heard of him, and I'd sort of had a vaguely, from the little I heard, I'd sort of had a vaguely positive impression of Eckhart.
Province of Saxonia, which is eastern and northern Germany. He was very successful here as well, founding a few convents for women and retaining a very high status within the Dominican order. After this, he returned once again to Paris to serve a second term as Regent Master, this time
Eastern
for 2 years,
mysticism,
before relocating to
Greek philosophy ECT.
Yeah. Yeah.
Strasbourg in 1313, and finally to the city of Cologne in either
All influencing
1323 or
Christian thought.
Yeah.
1324,
Yeah.
where he spent
But
his last years. All of this to show you that Eckhart was no controversial mystic on the fringes of society or the church, at least for most of his life. He was a very successful and reputable man within the Dominican order and also through that in the church generally. In all his time moving around from different cities, he wrote many literary works, primarily in Latin. Much of this corpus of his writings consists of Latin works that are mostly commentaries, so philosophical commentaries on certain books of the Bible. These Latin works of prose are fascinating and interesting enough in themselves, but it wasn't here that he left his biggest mark on history. Indeed, Eckhart was a magnificent preacher, and he preached a lot. He preached in convents and universities, but he also preached to the general masses around Germany. And in these sermons, he used the vernacular language of Middle High German, that is, the language spoken by the regular people. Indeed, this was a time when the German language had begun to be used in a religious way, primarily by some of the women mystics of the region, like the Beguines, for example. Now, Eckhart, of course, picks up on this general trend in the region and uses his native language of German to get very creative linguistically and create some truly awe-inspiring imagery and phrases. Many of Eckhart's sermons sermons survive in written form, and they make up the bulk of what has made him so controversial but also so beloved at the same time. The use of the vernacular language allowed Eckhart to create a very emotional and vibrant way of talking about his mystical ideas about God, the soul, and their union, among many other things. This is somewhat in contrast to his scholastic treatises, which, being tied to the much more established theological language of Latin, does not come off as creative and as striking. But these sermons, along with some of his Latin treatises as well, did get him into some trouble. Indeed, by the end of his life, he was actually tried for heresy by the Pope John the 22nd.
Yeah, and this is sort of kind of my point, right? Is that the people who sort of do this stuff, they end up in trouble, right? So my point is that actual Christianity is going to be more like typically represented by something like the Pope. Yeah.
Certain sections from his writings and sermons were picked out as being possibly heretical or dangerous. And he had to defend himself both in person and in written form. In any case, this was, of course, a long process. There was an investigation. Eckhart had to defend himself in trials and so on. This process was so long, in fact, that before it even ended, Eckhart had already died. We're not entirely sure how or when Eckhart died, but scholars suggest that he probably died of natural causes. He was pretty old at this time, and that it may have been on January 28th, 1328. As the investigation against Eckhart concluded after he died, he was not actually deemed a heretic, as opposed to what many people tend to say when they talk about this. Instead, 28 parts or 28 sections from his writings or sermons were picked out and deemed as either heretical or as dangerous, which indeed did leave a kind of a black mark on his reputation for some time afterwards. But this did not stop him, of course, from being immensely popular and as having many devoted followers and students. And today, he is generally accepted as a great teacher within the Catholic Church. But now it's time to get into the meat of the discussion. What were these ideas that were so powerful and controversial? What did he say in his sermons and his written works? Now, Eckhart can be a seriously difficult thinker, and there is often disagreement on how he should be interpreted or how some of his core ideas should be understood. But one of the foremost scholars of Eckhart today, Bernard McGinn, has argued that if Eckhart's teachings or ideas can be summarized under one phrase or name, it would be the mysticism of the ground. The ground is in fact one of the central themes in all of his sermons, and a concept which everything else revolves around. The original word which Eckhart uses is the German Grund, which is, as we have seen, translated as ground, but in fact can have a much broader and more creative use in its original German form. In the words of McGinn, quote, Grund can first of all be understood as physical ground, that is the earth. Grund can also mean the bottom or lowest side of a body's surface or structure. Abstractly, Grund is employed to indicate the origin, cause, beginning, reason, or proof of something. Finally, Grund is employed as what is inmost, hidden, and most proper to a being, that is, its essence. In some ways, this is quite different from how the word ground usually functions in English, and thus the German word Grund gives Eckhart the opportunity to play around a lot with terms and concepts. But in any case, the way
Grund
that
base
Eckhart
essence
uses
beginning.
the word Grund
okay.
is to signify a radical and striking point about the nature of reality. To the Dominican master, the ground of the soul and the ground of God is one and the same ground. In fact, in a lot of his sermons and writings, he talks about the ground in an indistinct way. So he's not talking about the divine ground or the ground of the soul, because when he talks about the ground, there is no distinction between these two. Quote, it is not because either the soul is grounded in its essential reality or God in his, but because they are both grounded in the same ground, in a fused identity, that Eckhart and his followers found the language of the ground so rich in meaning.
Yeah, and this is exactly what you get in Advaita Vedanta, right? Which is the sort of, you are the same as everything else, as everyone else, including this idea of a sort of God, which isn't really considered to exist, of course, like the Christian God is considered to exist. So yeah, that again, but this is Eckhartism. It's not really Christianity anymore. It's his own thing. You go, just basic Christianity does not talk about this ground thing. So again, this brings me to the point that Christian people can sort of elaborate on Christianity and improve on it and actually find correct things. But I would say that at this point it's no longer Christianity. And so, but it points to that there is a kind of universal thing. And I think the fact that Christians sort of almost, I mean, obviously not independently because he was aware of all of these other religions as well, but the fact that he still somewhat on his own came up with this stuff, it kind of gives more and more credence also to the fact that this kind of maybe is a real thing. Although to me it's a real thing just in the sense that it's a feeling, right? I think it's some sort of real feeling that somehow apparently is quite somehow, powerful and pleasurable. So I think it's something that should indeed be sought. Yeah.
The ground or Grund is a metaphor that describes the very zenith or center of reality or of the divine. It is incomprehensible beyond all being or language or particularity. It is God, but it is also beyond God. What I mean by that is that it's beyond God as we
It's
commonly
probably enriching if
understand
you
God.
can go deep into your own mind and find the universal God to have a deeply personal dialogue with.
Yeah, but of course it's still just going to be a feeling, right? Like there isn't an actual universal God that you're talking to, right? It's just a feeling of universal God or whatever. And again, like I said, it seems to be a nice feeling. So from just that perspective, as long as you recognize that it's just a feeling and that it's not actually, something true, then definitely it's a good thing.
God. It is beyond the Trinity of the Christian theology or even the oneness of God itself. But it nonetheless is God in God's absolute and essential reality. The ground is utterly the silent and empty abyss, which in German is Abgrund, by the way. That is the true essence of the Godhead. It is the starting point of reality, from which everything, including divinity, emanates, and to which everything eventually flows back. And in the Grund there is no distinction. The soul and God, everything, is absolutely indistinct from each other. They are fundamentally one. Eckhart himself puts it in very plain words, quote, God's ground and the soul's ground is one ground. And, quote, here God's ground is my ground, and my ground is God's ground. And this sounds radical, of course, and to some it may appear to...
Yeah, and in some way it's even maybe a bit more, it goes a bit further than the sort of typical, like just feeling of being one with God, right? Because here we're saying that rather there's something even
abyss.
More, yeah, it's even a bit more, it goes beyond that, right? Because it's just sort of more this abstract thing beyond this notion of self or God. And that's so yeah, I mean, so then the question is, did he himself sort of experience these things? Like apparently he did. I
Endless
think maybe he's
infinity.
going to talk about this a bit more. So maybe we'll see what he says about this.
Perceived as Christian orthodoxy, but Eckhart insisted that this is an essential feature of Christianity and the divine word. Quote, now know all of our perfection and our holiness rests in this, that a person must penetrate and transcend everything created and temporal and all being and go into the ground that has no ground. We pray our dear Lord God that we may become one and indwelling. As this section suggests, the ultimate goal is to penetrate back into God, to detach from the world of particularities and individualism and return back to our source. And eventually, the further we reach, even God himself will unbecome, as, quote, the mystic is not content to return to the God who acts, but effects a breaking through to the silent, unmoving Godhead. As we break through, we reach beyond the God as commonly perceived, beyond the Trinity, and enter into the silent, empty desert of the ground, the Grund.
And that's sort of where you go, like further, like there's this sort of idea in like in Buddhism, where you have this idea that you're sort of experience lots of sort of pleasure and this idea of sort of oneness with the sort of thing, and then you go beyond that and rather you see the emptiness behind that, right? And so it's a sort of an ulterior stage of development. It seems like he got past that first stage into the sort of next stage, but then the idea is that you go even beyond that, because then there's still a concept of sort of emptiness, and then you've got to see that even emptiness is still a concept in a sense, and so it's not really empty. So then you go beyond emptiness into simply sort of just nothing, right? And that's the sort of idea
Yes,
of
clear parallels with Buddhist mysticism.
and that's the idea then of
I see it too.
this nothing is the actual like just no, like what they call no self, like I'm Atman, and that's a sort of like the sort of ultimate sort of attainment when you really see that it's not even nothingness but just nothing at all, like without this ness that imparts a sort of existence to nothing. But again, I don't, obviously these are just things that you feel, like it doesn't, when I just say it like this intellectually, I'm just like, okay, but like it doesn't really mean, I don't really understand it, it doesn't really mean much to me. And the reason I've been interested in this is just more because because sometimes I sort of can feel that sometimes I perceive things differently and sort of more deeply, and it's quite pleasurable, and I feel that if I sort of went more in that direction, I would sort of be able to see things like
Transcendence of the
more
ego,
truly.
to let go your own worldly needs.
Yeah. But like, why does one want to do that? I think it's because it's a sort of a kind of subtle pleasure from it, right? A subtle pleasure of seeing things in sort of more profound fashion, right? That's what makes it worthwhile.
Where God and human achieves indistinct identity in the simple one. But this indistinction and oneness is always there. It is not that the mystic becomes one with God, but realizes his already essential oneness. Of course,
Yeah.
many Christians.
So and of course that's another sort of thing that you see a lot of in both like the sort of Buddhist stuff and the Advaita stuff, is that it's not that you become anything
In this
different.
sense, Christianity is anti-capitalism.
Well, not necessarily, actually, because I mean, capitalism is at another level, right? You can very much realize that you're, in a sort of more ultimate sort of letting go of your personal attachments, but you still just act in, in a capitalist system. I don't think that's contradictory because it's on different levels. I don't think that kind of thing doesn't actually say specifically what kind of, system. I think that kind of thing is much too mundane for this kind of endeavor, for this kind of sort of thing that we're talking about. So I feel it's just it's compatible with kind of anything, really. Oh no, again, I can't, I got rid of the sound. Okay. Why does it say not okay. Connected. 1615.
And thinkers prior to Eckhart had also talked about uniting with God. But in most cases, this was referring to a kind of intimacy with God, or as being one with God in spirit. And
yeah, see, that's a sort of typical Christian way of seeing being one with God, right? And it's that I think is more a false feeling, just a sort of a false delusion of somehow having, some sort of closeness with your buddy pal, super god man in the sky or whatever, and that is what most Christian people, like the vast majority of people who consider themselves Christian, right? They're going to be aiming for that kind of thing, right? They're aiming themselves with like a very close relationship, in the same way that you might sort of want a fusional relationship with your boyfriend or something, that's kind of what they're getting at, and I think that is really, that is nonsense, and it's just, it's not healthy. And again, to me, that is more like the actual Christian thing. And Eckhart thinks, well, through Christianity, he managed to actually end up finding something more true. But I guess he just was a bit brighter than most people or something.
Not necessarily a complete identity between the two, but this indeed seems to be what Eckhart is indicating. The closest we find to Eckhart's expressions is in the Christian mystic women of the 13th and 14th centuries, and especially with the Beguine movement. In the writings of some of these Beguines, like Mechthild of Magdeburg or Hadewig, we find similar expressions
Well, I
of
wouldn't call
oneness
it
with
nonsense,
God,
but Eckhart
and
wanted to go
especially in the
deeper.
French mystic Marguerite.
Well, what makes it nonsense is that you actually believe it, and there's this idea of God just being this sort of person and being the specific person as described in the Bible, and that to me is the nonsense aspect. If you're, obviously, if you're just aiming for a certain feeling of connection with just some sort of thing that isn't described because you know that it's just a feeling, then that's different. But the thing is that that's not how they're approaching it, right? It's nonsense because fundamentally what they believe is not actually true. If you're just aiming for the feeling, if you're just aiming for the feeling of having a connection with some imaginary old dude in the sky, knowing that it's just a feeling and that isn't actually true, then that's not nonsense. But there's hardly anybody that does that. I'm not sure there's anybody that does that.
Porret, who had been burnt at the stake for heresy in 1310, so right around the time that Eckhart would
And see,
hang around
notice,
in
like,
Paris.
he literally burned alive for heresy. Like, that's that's not necessarily all Christianity, but like much, at the time that is still what people, what Christians did. I mean, it's monstrous, right? It's monstrous.
An external God unconnected with us as opposed to an internal God that can be known when exploring your inner self.
Yeah, but see, hardly any actual Christian, except for a few of these mystics, right? It's just these mystics that get considered heretics or quasi-heretics. It's only those mystics that are talking about these sort of internal gods. And then again, the internal God isn't really an actual God, right? It's not. Again, it really is just more like a feeling of that. It's not an actual God. And of course, I do believe in a God, so to speak, right? And I think that's where this whole idea of a God, why do we have such a strong belief in God in the first place?
Well, he is rather popular with Christians.
He is popular with probably a certain sect of Christians, and probably they're not necessarily seeing it in the same way that he does. I don't actually know. I'm just speculating. I don't know to what extent he is popular with what groups of people. But yeah. But the problem is that basically the good stuff of Eckhart is the non-Christian stuff. But of course that doesn't mean that believing sort of like the Christian God is wrong either, because like I said, I believe in the Gorth, which is kind of I think that is what inspired people to believe in God, is that they have this sort of connection with this actual God, the Gorth. And I think that people are picking up on that because through this mechanism that I call the Zeld, right, which enables people to sort of be in tune with sort of certain other sort of supernatural things, so to speak, and so people are sort of aware of that, but they have a vague feeling, but it's pretty strong because there's lots of memory of this. And so the idea is that people used to actually interact with the Gorth as one would with God if God actually spoke to people like God originally speaks to people in the Bible, right? You say like, "Hey God," and God says back like, "Hey mental states, how's it going?" And then you ask God a question like, "God, do you know what's the weather's going to be next week?" And God says like, "Yeah, it's going to be raining or something." And so my belief is that actually did happen for a long period of time.
Well, maybe you rediscovered something Eckhart was onto.
Did I rediscover something? Well, no, I didn't rediscover it in the sense that I mean, lots of people have discovered it, and I don't think Eckhart was talking about that. See, I think they're two separate aspects. See, I think there's this sort of mystical feeling of God, which is what all these these Enlightenment stuff is about in these Eastern religions, in Indian religions, and that then got exported elsewhere in Asia. And that also gets talked about, for instance, like in Sufism and like in Eckhart and stuff. And that isn't actually God at all. It really is just an internal feeling, but it feels extremely profound, right? But it's still just a feeling fundamentally. Whereas then there actually is this actual intelligence, this omniscient intelligence, very powerful too, which is something completely distinct, which has nothing to do, in fact, with these feelings, except that this intelligence can influence those feelings. But this intelligence is what I'm calling the Gorth. But to me, it's an artificial intelligence, right? It was actually just created by early anthropes, which is like the equivalent of humans, but like from other planets. This is my theory as to how things work, and that I think is distinct. But that's where we have all these beliefs in an actual God that actively, that's not just a feeling, but that actually has like thoughts and that can interact with people and that can influence events, is because there is such a thing, and it's the Gorth, right? And so those are two very distinct things. What Eckhart's talking about is not that, but what Christianity is talking about is that. And what Christianity is talking about is in fact the Gorth. And it's to me, the Christian God is, and the devil, and the angels and everything, they're actually all just a sort of distorted, mythologized rendition of the Gorth. And so, and in fact, what's interesting is that there's this idea that Christianity, Yahwehism, Abrahamic religions are sort of more advanced because monotheism is sort of a more advanced thing, because people originally start out being like animistic and then polytheistic and then monotheistic. But in fact, these religions aren't monotheistic at all, since they believe in a bunch of angels and stuff as well, right? Whereas my thing, on the other hand, is much more monotheistic in the sense that there's just the Gorth. Although I would imagine that originally there would have been multiple Gorths, and that then eventually there's just one that ended up taking over, or maybe even the Gorth actually might be just multiple Gorths acting together and just interacting so well that it just becomes a single entity. That's also possible. But in the end, it does amount to just having just one thing, just one mind, essentially, just acting as a unit. And so in that sense, I'm actually more monotheistic. My Gorth thing is more monotheistic than
I wouldn't
Yahwehism.
separate feeling as much with omniscient thought. They could well be connected because most thoughts invoke feelings and feelings invoke thoughts.
I have to disagree there. To me, these sort of feelings that you get from sort of mystical stuff or spirituality and whatever, to me these are really probably just feelings that have no. It doesn't, like, when these people experience these things, they don't actually become omniscient at all. They don't know things. They feel like they know everything, but they actually don't know any more than your average person. They don't actually have any knowledge. You ask them like some specific question, they're not going to be able to answer it, right? So no, I disagree. I think, again, those are very two different things. Like there's this feeling of of universality and whatever, and then there's this artificial intelligence, the Gorth, which is just an artificial intelligence, a very sophisticated piece of technology, which it does, it's very advanced at cognition, but actually isn't even conscious at all. Like in my model, the Gorth is actually not conscious. It's like a computer. It can be much faster than you at calculating stuff, but it doesn't actually have any awareness. It's not, there's no self that experiences being the Gorth, right? That's the way I see it. Of course, it could be wrong, but I would say probably that is the case. Of course, I understand that it obviously seems very weird from pretty much everyone's perspective, since nobody's ever heard of or has even imagined, because nobody's even like ever suggested, even in fiction, such a thing, basically.
If you can have
I
Uranus,
understand that it feels.
why not the Gorth?
I understand that it can seem weird. Nonetheless, I think that the evidence is very strongly in favor of the existence of such a thing at this point, which is why I believe in it. You say if you can have awareness, why not the Gorth? Because I think essentially awareness is very, very hard to achieve. From on my model, again, there's no way I can actually know, right? It's not certainly not metaphysically impossible. In a sense, it's not unimaginable that the Gorth have awareness. But I think in practice,
But
it
being
doesn't.
entangled with a machine mind seems scary.
Well, it is kind of scary. And especially right now, it's scary since the Gorth is actively trying to hurt us. But it's so that it can later on give us more pleasure, more of these feelings of, mystical enlightenment and whatnot. But it is definitely scary right now, yeah. But it's not really entanglement. Like it's kind of it. It is kind of entanglement, I guess, if you will. But the reason, from my model, the reason the Gorth is not conscious is because consciousness requires specifically a soul, and a soul to be then incarnated into a body, right? So that is how you get consciousness, and a body with a brain at that. So that's the only way that you get consciousness, and otherwise you just don't get consciousness. And basically the Gorth is not that. The Gorth does not have a soul. It's not incarnated into a body, and so it's, to me, it's not conscious. Obviously, I don't know, because I don't know how things work. I don't know how the Zeld works. Maybe it could be, but I just don't believe so. But that's sort of why I said that. And then, but obviously I can't prove it. It just basically seems that, other stuff doesn't seem to have consciousness either, like computers, right? Just because you have an intelligence doesn't mean you have a consciousness. Of course, we don't know absolutely that computers
Meister
don't have
Eckhart said that the ground of the soul and the ground of God is the same ground.
Yes, but again, I think he's wrong. I think he's referring to God in that feeling God, like you have in Advaita, right? Where you're like, I am one with Brahman, I'm one with the sort of universal self or whatnot, right? He's not talking about one ground with the Gorth. Again, I think that is wrong. But again, that is my model. I've made pretty significant changes to my model since I first I discovered it. In any case, I didn't actually come up with it. It's Philip Goddard from clarityofbeing.org that came up with it. And unfortunately, and I feel kind of silly, I should have been able to come up with it on my own, and I didn't. And I feel kind of a bit ashamed at that. I feel a bit sort of frustrated, a bit regretful. But yeah, he came up with it, and then I've elaborated and modified his model. But he himself says that the Gorth is not probably conscious, and that's where I first had the idea of the Gorth not being conscious, and I agree with that. It does seem to strike me as being the most plausible, precisely for the same reason that like computers aren't conscious. So
as well.
Yeah.
It's quite likely thus that Eckhart was familiar with her masterpiece, The Mirror of Simple Souls, which is what got her executed. It would thus be safe to say that Eckhart was influenced on the one hand, of course, by some of the great scholastic philosophers and theologians like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, but also by some of the Beguines that were flourishing.
It's beyond a description of a feeling is a metaphysical concept of the mind in relation to the highest being of this universe, I think.
Yes, it is. It is definitely. It's a sort of intuitive understanding of that. Yes, it definitely, in a way, it is beyond a feeling, of course, and it certainly feels like it's more than a feeling, But in a way, it also still is just a feeling, right? Because you can't actually explain it. You can't explain it. So since you can't explain it logically with your words, that's why I say that it's a feeling. But yes, it is a kind of, it is also more than a feeling. It's a kind of understanding, but a different, like an understanding that's not, cognitively explicable. So it's sort of like, it's like gnosis in Greek, which means like it's that kind of understanding versus just intellectual understanding, which is like a episteme or something. So yeah, but that also still, of course, remains very distinct from the whole Gorth thing, because the Gorth thing is not at all. Well, no, it also is, because the Gorth understands these things as well. The Gorth understands everything, so it also understands feelings and these sort of very deep sort of things of like those understandings, metaphysical understandings, whatever. The Gorth knows all those things and understands all those things, but it doesn't actually experience them. Probably, or maybe it does. But that's just the model. I'm just stating this. Maybe it does. Maybe it does. Again, my thing is not a religion. See, that's the difference. Is I'm not just dogmatically saying it is like this. I think it just more likely. I think it's this way, but it could also be that way, right?
Both in language and also in ideas.
Let's continue. Let's see if we get inspired to other thoughts.
Both God and the soul is really only the starting point of Eckhart's very complex theology and metaphysics. He has a lot more to say on subjects like, well, God, the soul, creation and ethics, among much more. The more scholastic metaphysics of Eckhart's works, expressed in his Latin treatises and commentaries on the Bible, paints the picture of a very complex and often hard to understand theology. Eckhart even warns himself that if not understood properly, many of the things he says will come off as heretical. There's a lot to go through here, so bear with me. But let's start with that very central thing to, well, most Christians, which is of course God. Who is God and how does Eckhart understand him? Well, the first thing that needs to be understood is that Eckhart's theology is a heavily negative or apophatic one. What this means is that he applies the sort of theology where, when all is said and done, nothing can be said or grasped about God. He is utterly beyond any description or intellectual understanding, and the best response is really just silence. In this, he is heavily influenced by two of his predecessors, his fellow Dominican Thomas Aquinas and the Jewish philosopher Maimonides. Indeed, to Eckhart, God in his absolute Grund, is even identified as nothingness, as a total and absolute absence of any thingness, and an absolute abyss and darkness which cannot be grasped. But he still has a few things to say about God, and one of the key discussions here is on the so-called transcendentals, that is, attributes or qualities that apply to God and creatures, which includes things like being and existence, oneness, goodness, and truth. In Eckhart's thought, God is in fact the only one who possesses these qualities. So God is being and existence. God is goodness, God is oneness, and none of these things belong to created things. Quote, analogates have nothing of the form according to which they are analogically ordered, rooted in positive fashion in themselves, but every created being is analogically ordered to God in existence, truth, and goodness. Therefore, every created being radically and positively possesses existence, life, and wisdom from God and in God and not in itself. Indeed, one of the most recurring themes in Eckhart is that he identifies the essence of God with being itself, or more precisely, indistinct being, meaning he doesn't have being in the sense that a creature or anything has being or existence. He is pure being or pure existence in itself. And because God is the sole possessor of this attribute, this means that when it comes to created things, like me and you and all things in the universe, they are absolutely nothing in themselves. Any being or existence that you or I have is really God's being, and thus identical to God himself, insofar as it is being. And the same can be said about the other transcendental qualities, like goodness. God, again, is goodness itself, and any goodness in creatures is really God's goodness. Here it is important to grasp one of the key features of Eckhart's thought, the so-called in quantum principle, often expressed with the term
This maybe comes close to the Chinese concept of
If we
qi.
return to the quality of goodness, for example, a good person is participating in eternal goodness, and thus God himself.
Okay, it's time for me to eat. So when it comes close to the Chinese concept of qi, I think I think the Chinese concept of qi is actually quite different because qi, from what I've seen, is more about the sort of energy, like in the body, like the immaterial energy of the body. I think this is a lot sort of more, um, how should you say, more transcendental than the qi. The qi is much more sort of almost physical. It's like a quasi. It's sort of like what New Agers would call like the etheric body or something. Um, so it is very much just related to your own incarnation and not a sort of more um, abstract, universal, sort of metaphysical thing like good. Like good or God or something like that. So I would say that is there even something comparable? Well, not really. Certainly not in like Chinese sort of medicines. It's Chinese medicine is like very much prosaic ultimately. Um, it's is it more maybe like something like the Tower or something like that? Maybe like I'm
Life
sure I know
force,
enough to be able to
the
say
New
that.
Age understanding of this ancient Chinese concept is rather limited.
But yeah, but I don't think it's necessarily limited. I think it's that's referring to something else. I think these are distinct things. I think there's probably lots of stuff going on, and I think that the chi is a much more sort of prosaic kind of thing that is sort of very much more just linked to your own physical limited body. And meanwhile, this stuff is something that really much transcends the body. So I think it's actually again something very distinct. Um, though I don't know. Like again, this I don't know if the Chinese have an equivalent concept apart through Buddhism. I mean, through Buddhism they do. I don't know if they have an equivalent non-Buddhist way of seeing that. Um, Maybe, but I don't know. So like I said, actually, I've got to go and eat. Yeah, I'm gonna be stopping the stream. So anyway, I've been streaming for quite some time now. This stream's been 1 hour 40 minutes, and we already did half an hour before, so it's been 2 hours and 10 minutes that I've been talking. My throat is getting a bit tired, so I think it's good to stop. Anyway, thanks. This was interesting, definitely. Let's see. If you come back, okay. So we're halfway through. We can say not quite halfway through. Um, so I'm not going to be streaming much.
Nice, thanks.
Like I haven't been streaming much.
See
But
you later.
If I'm probably not going to be streaming again today, because I'm kind of tired. But like, yeah, if you want to come back, we can see the second half this week. All right.
Yes, we will finish this dialogue.
Yep. Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks for coming by and for participating, and hope to see you around. All right.